So those of you who are familiar with evolutionary biology know that coevolution between hosts and parasites is important, it's common, it explains a lot in evolutionary biology of animal behavior, evolutionary anthropology, evolutionary psychology, and evolutionary medicine. For example, sexual reproduction itself seems to have evolved partly as an anti-pathogen defense under the Red Queen hypothesis. Sexual ornaments, like these birds of paradise. Sexual ornaments often advertise partly parasite resistance as part of genetic quality and phenotypic condition. The behavioral immune system, which is the concept that humans evolved psychological mechanisms for avoiding infestation and contagion, including anti-pathogen disgust and sexual disgust. These are defenses against pathogens, part of host-parasite coevolution. And mutualism, right? Positive some interactions between the gut microbiome and us, the human hosts. And there are lots of other examples where host-parasite coevolution is important. We also know there are lots of different common sexually transmitted organisms, what I'll call STOs in humans. I won't call them STIs, infections, or STDs, diseases, because perhaps some of them don't actually count as diseases. That's prejudging whether they're actually harmful. But they are sexually transmitted organisms, so they're passed along through penile-vaginal intercourse or kissing or other sexual behaviors. And these include things like viruses, like herpes, HPV, Hep B, and HIV. They also include bacteria that cause syphilis, gonorrhea, chlamydia, and protozoa that cause trich, and other things, macroparasites, for example, scabies and crabs. Human STOs are known to be important to sexual health. They seem to drive some, but not all, of sexual disgust. Things that we find disgusting to do sexually are influenced by pathogen transmission risk. And they seem to drive quite a bit of sexual morality at the level of human culture. Certainly some of them cause some serious health problems, like infertility. But many of them are mild or asymptomatic, and you can only tell you have them if you get a particular chemical test. We know they evolve very fast because they're small and they're fast breeding, and we're big and slow breeding. We know that many of the ones that cause the most problems nowadays in modern cultures are zoonotic. They're from domesticated animals, and they jumped ship into our bodies fairly recently, perhaps within the last few thousand years for many of them. And also, many of them are fairly recently adapted to urban populations. So when syphilis first showed up in post-Renaissance Europe, probably transmitted from North America, it was extremely virulent and really harmful and caused a lot of death. But then it rapidly adapted to cause less death, to be less virulent. So these things can evolve within the span of historical centuries. Uh-oh. There's some deep evolutionary theory that when I first read about it kind of spooked me. And one goal of this talk is to make you really unsettled and a little bit disgusted, and to make you think about STOs in a different way. We know that a lot of parasites evolve much faster than their larger-bodied, slower-breeding hosts, as I mentioned already. And the folks who study the coevolutionary implications of this often call parasites evolution's neurobiologists, because they hack the nervous system of the host. They figure out how to manipulate the host nervous system and neuromodulator systems in ways that are in their interests, not in the interests of the host necessarily. So the parasite basically turns the host's behavior into a part of its own extended phenotype in its interests. And there are lots of non-human examples of parasitic manipulation in non-human animals and also in humans. When you get trophic transmission, that is, if the parasite is transmitted by the host being eaten by a bigger predator, what the parasites then tend to do is make the host, the potential prey animal, bolder, less cautious, more risk-seeking, more exploratory, so it's easier for predators to see and catch, but also slower, less uncoordinated, so it can't escape as easily. That's a very typical outcome of trophic transmission through the food chain. But sexual transmission tends to have different effects. It often drives animals to do more courtship behavior. Frogs call more, animals display more. They actually get more attractive because that's what helps transmit the parasite. They get more active, they copulate with more mates. Sometimes they get less choosy about who they copulate with. So the question is, how would you want your human host to behave if you can imagine I'm syphilis, imagine I'm herpes, imagine I'm chlamydia, imagine I'm a pubic louse. What would you want your host to do? I want you to take actually seriously a few seconds and think about that. If you could manipulate your host behavior, what would you do? Oh, sorry. This is, well, how would you want your human host to behave if you were a human gene? So if you were kind of one of these lumbering robots that Richard Dawkins talks about, where you're basically a vehicle for propagating human genes, imagine instead it was a virus that was in charge. What would you do? Most of this talk is about what would you do. I'm going to come up with a bunch of possible effects and transmission mechanisms that I think would be worth exploring. My caution here is that this talk, developed by me and my collaborator Diana Fleischman, it's a new research area, woefully understudied. We are not STO experts. We are not parasitologists. We're just well-meaning evolutionary psychologists who think this is a cool area of biology that might be relevant to these issues. We don't have any new data yet. I'm not going to present a series of studies on here's how STOs manipulate human host behavior. This is very tricky to do randomized controlled trials in. Because what was the main motivation for human subjects committees in the first place? That little thing called the Tuskegee syphilis study, right? So this is not easy to do research on. But there is some research on parasitic manipulation of human behavior by, not an STO, by Toxoplasmodium. There's almost no research on parasitic manipulation of human sexual behavior. Not yet. So this is a theoretical talk, an integrative review talk. But Dawkins himself suggests this might be worth looking at. I do not know of any direct evidence, he writes, that sexually transmitted diseases increase the libido of sufferers, for example. But I conjecture that it would be worth looking into. Generally, things that Richard Dawkins thinks are worth looking into are worth looking into. And this is from the Selfish Gene. I don't think it was in the original 1976 Selfish Gene, but he updates it cleverly to include new predictions. How could this possibly work? How could syphilis or herpes make us do things against our will or against the interests of human genes? This is not going to work by precision neurosurgery on particular brain circuits. That's not how parasitic manipulation generally works. If the parasites could reach up from the genitals and do precision neurosurgery and precisely modulate your mate preferences or your libido or your courtship strategies, of course they would love to be able to do that. They probably can't. However, we have a lot of evidence that in other species, parasites can influence more diffuse neuromodulator levels and gene expression patterns that control facultative behavioral strategies, things where humans already respond in different ways to different environmental contingencies with different sexual behavior. Those are easy targets for manipulation because, you know, our brains are already built to respond to neuromodulator signals with different sexual behaviors. So that could include mechanisms like ovulatory cycle shifts like we see in women. We know women, when they're about to ovulate, have different mate preferences, different mate search strategies, different modes of self-ornamentation. And those are all modulated by hormones and other neuromodulators. So that could be a target where if you're a parasite, you might want your host to behave more like they're ovulating or more like they're not ovulating. Condition-dependent mate preferences, where you're assessing how healthy I am, what's my phenotypic condition. If I'm feeling healthy and and capable, maybe I mate more avidly, right? So if the parasite could get you to believe that, that would be an advantage. Short versus long-term mating, right? We're very sensitive to environmental conditions like what's the local sex ratio in the mating pool. So again, if the parasite can tap into those levers and manipulate behavior and get you perhaps to do more short-term mating, that might make sense. And also, if you're in a relationship, do you stay in it and put a lot of effort into mate retention, or do you mate switch and find another mate, right? That's another kind of psychology of mating allocation, a mating effort that could be manipulable. So don't think precision neurosurgery, think instead, what could the parasite do to manipulate things like dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine, histamine, etc. So the next few slides, I'm going to run through some ways that I think, Diana and I think, you could perhaps manipulate human host behavior to promote your own replication if you are an STO. So one thing is just promote consensual short-term mating. Get out there more, spread the STO around more. So how do you do that? One thing is there's a personality trait called sociosexuality that we know is heritable, and it's stable, and it differs between individuals, but it's also facultatively manipulable. And it's about how much effort do you put into pursuing multiple short-term mates versus a few long-term mates. Number two, broaden mate choice standards. So someone who doesn't seem good enough or doesn't seem in your normal catchment area or doesn't seem the right ethnicity or religious group or isn't a close enough phenocopy of what you are, just broaden those standards so that you're willing to mate with somebody who's not in your normal mating pool as you perceive it. It's also clear that anti-pathogen disgust, sexual disgust, and moral disgust inhibit mating in various ways. So if you could adaptively tune down disgust levels in any of those three domains, then that would be helpful in terms of spreading if you're an STO. One great thing to do is to jump ship from your clan into other clans, from your tribe into other tribes. So if you promote long-range out-group mating, like, oh, I've got an STO, I don't know it, but suddenly I feel like I really must emigrate to America from Europe because it's 1600. Right? That might be a really good strategy for spreading very far and wide. Also, if normally heterosexual behavior is somehow adaptive in a narrow sense of maximizing reproductive success, again, spread your mate choice standards to different sexes. Right? So promote bisexuality, promote male homosexuality, for example. I'm not saying that these things are caused principally by STOs, but STOs might nudge them around in certain directions. Diversify your transmission pathways. So instead of just transmitting through penile vaginal intercourse and your human host thinking that's the only thing worth doing, right? You want to broaden what people do behaviorally. Lock lips with somebody else. Other primates don't typically do that. Bonobos accepted. So kissing might suddenly become a good idea. Anal might be a good idea. All sorts of weird things might be good ideas that didn't seem like good ideas before the STOs. Typically also, if you don't have STO manipulation, you don't want to necessarily copulate with women in short term if they're in non-fertile cycle phases, or if they're pregnant, or if they're postmenopausal. But if any of those folks in turn might copulate later with somebody they could spread the STO to, you might go, well, yeah, she's pregnant, but still hot, right? Postmenopausal, but still hot. To the extent that sex-positive attitudes are heritable and biologically influenced, you might also want to influence those in a sort of general level that might show up in political attitude surveys. And again, these are all an easy target because you can nudge existing facultative sexual strategies around so that you just do a little more of what would be in the STO's interest.
We have to wait for questions till the end, yeah?
Yes, please. So that was all about consensual short-term mating. There's also non-consensual or exploitative short-term mating. So one thing STOs might do is follow a kind of 50 Shades of Herpes strategy. where you're increasing the sexual dominance or coerciveness or the so-called dark triad traits of a male. Dark triad meaning Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy. Because then those tend to increase your ability to do sexual stalking, harassment, and coercion, which are morally bad. Okay, yes, they're morally bad, but STOs don't care about morally bad. In females, the opposite effect might happen. It might increase sexual submissiveness and exploitability so that you're more easily exploited and manipulated by males. Now, this is not to say that 50 Shades style BDSM is an STO strategy. BDSM community is actually a lot more into consent and being really careful about what do you want to do and having safe words and all that. This is more about the non-consensual stuff. Also, in both sexes, in terms of exploitative short-term mating, you might reduce incest aversion. You might lower your perceived minimum age of sexual consent that makes sense, so more hebephilia. You might promote a so-called night owl chronotype, stay up later, sleep in later, for more covert mating at night when nobody else can see you. You might also be particularly tuned into, I want to target unusually attractive and promiscuous short-term mates who will in turn spread the STO outwards, right? You don't want to mate with somebody who's going to be monogamous the rest of their life, because the STO will die with them, or just spread to their mate and then they trade it back and forth forever. That's no fun. Here's where things get really alarming. Your STO, again, doesn't want you to be stuck in a lifelong monogamous marriage. That's a dead end from its point of view. So you want to disrupt long-term mating. If an STO is highly contagious from just a few exposures, like trich and syphilis seem to be, one thing you could do is just promote irritability, aggression, laziness, impulsivity, infidelity, anything that makes your long-term mate unhappy with you, makes them want to mate switch. If you have any mood disorders, any propensity, for example, for bipolar mania or a propensity for borderline personality disorder, an STO would very much like to exacerbate that and make sure your lithium is not working. All of that to promote mate switching. But if the STO is less contagious, like HSV or HPV, if it takes a few more sex acts to transmit itself, you don't want to just mate switch immediately after, like only be in the relationship for a month and then switch, because the STO won't transmit well enough. You want to promote medium-term relationships, long enough to infect but short enough to switch to new hosts. So there might be quite subtle adaptations where the propensity to do this might depend on the transmission rates. And things get even worse here. This is the most Machiavellian thing you can do. STO strategy 4, kill babies to prolong sexual activity. Parental effort reduces mating effort. That's a basic tenet of life history theory. There's trade-offs between seeking new mates versus investing in existing kids. So if you have existing kids, you're going to downplay, downregulate your mating effort, and you're not going to copulate as much with as many people. We know from animal studies that STOs often induce so-called parasitic castration. They induce infertility in animals. Why? To reduce parental effort and maintain mating effort at high levels for the rest of the organism's life. And we know that the typical bad effect of an STO, the main bad effects are to hurt women's fertility. So they can't get fertile in the first place, they have more miscarriages, more birth complications, more dead babies. And they do it through all kinds of devious routes, like chlamydia seems to induce higher levels of anti-sperm antibodies, ASAs, and that in turn induces infertility. Now, from the traditional medical viewpoint, all of these things are simply tragic complications of STOs. Like, why do STOs do this? We don't know. From my point of view, functionally, these are not just tragic complications. These are one of the main routes that STOs promote their replication in the human body. And they're fairly easy targets. Like, if you're an STO, simply induce a strong immune response in the fallopian tubes to block eggs coming down and getting fertilized. An even worse effect would be, well, you know, if you really want to interfere with long-term relationships, you don't want to induce infertility immediately necessarily. You might allow a conception, but then make sure the baby dies upon delivery. Right? Why? Because that especially undermines pair bonds, and the grief from the baby loss induces more mate switching. So that's a really devious, quite nasty effect that could happen. STO strategy number 5 is minimize your symptoms of the STO to evade defenses, but also to evade the mate choices of the other person who might be thinking about copulating with your host. Now we know there's antipathogen and sexual disgust to avoid STOs partly. And in women, there's a higher risk of receiving an STO infection per copulation and suffering a fitness cost in terms of infertility. And as a result, women have evolved typically higher disgust sensitivity than males have. But how do STOs get around this? Didn't know STOs could be asymptomatic, did ya? As William Wonka asks, rhetorically. Well, if you're an STO, what you want to do is reduce the physical contagion cues that would trigger sexual disgust in other potential mates and promote purely asymptomatic transmission, as many STOs have evolved to do. So there's a coevolutionary arms race where the host might actually sort of want to notice very subtle cues of infection, but the STO really wants to slip under the radar. And it's interesting that conservatives actually treat sex positivity or sexual liberalism or bisexuality or polyamory or anything like this as if it's a kind of cultural STD, right, that triggers sexual and moral disgust. Maybe they're onto something. I don't know. It's worth thinking about. On the positive side, STOs could, if they wanted to, if they could, they would actually kind of like to increase the host's sexual attractiveness so they could spread more easily. Increase their apparent mate value by nudging energetic and life history trade-offs, like get a little more attractive now even if you die a little younger later. The increased physical attractiveness would be not just hide contagion cues, but increase sexual ornamentation, skin quality, and the glossiness of hair, whatever it is. Somewhat whimsically, I put up here Derek Jeter, famous baseball star apparently, who's known to have genital herpes. And there are many, many Hollywood starlets and stars he's given it to, including allegedly, don't sue me, Scarlett Johansson. But you could also increase mental attractiveness. Right? If you could increase general intelligence, creativity, humor, art, or music, or the allocation of resources to those things, which I've argued elsewhere are principally sexual ornaments, do that. Or improve personality traits by increasing things like openness or extroversion. Or again, inducing bipolar hypomania to promote higher mating effort and creativity. And there's been a long-standing speculation going back about 150 years that maybe syphilis promotes kind of creativity, or what I would call creative courtship. It seems to result in increased sexual desire and disinhibition of sexual behavior and verbal behavior. And it seems to increase in some folks creativity in a way that's similar to L-DOPA treatment of Parkinson's disease. And Oliver Sacks has an interesting case study on this that I don't have time to go into, but I think it's worth reading. Shakespeare, Beethoven, and Gauguin all apparently, arguably had syphilis, and they didn't seem to suffer that much in terms of creativity, at least. Robert Schumann contracted a syphilis at age 21, and it advanced eventually to the tertiary stage, which is not good. But just before that, he had a kind of creative burst, and he developed a new sound that throughout the 1800s became known as the syphilitic sound because it had particularly strong rhythms, and it was kind of shocking to the listeners, and the composers who produced it seemed to mostly have syphilis. But it was attractive. Strategy 7, I think, is in some ways the most interesting. Can you evolve from parasitism, where you're imposing fitness costs on the host, to a kind of mutualism, where there's perhaps positive some benefits to both of you. Look, STOs want to replicate. That's the goal. They don't necessarily want to impose costs on us as parasites or disease as pathogens. They just want to do their thing. And if they can do it without hurting us, why not do that? We know that STOs often evolve to be commensal, neutral in terms of the host fitness, so stealthy that they're not even considered infections. Most of the 20 to 30 strains of HPV seem to be like that. They're pretty much asymptomatic. They don't cause health problems. They're just around. They get traded back and forth among folks. We don't even really notice them. They don't even show up in medicine as problems. But it's interesting they're there. They haven't died out. Could some STOs evolve to be actually mutualistic, beneficial, kind of like the gut microbiome? Well, nobody seems to have thought about that yet, but there can be a confluence of human and STO interests. Be more attractive, be more charming, have more sex. If you can increase physical health and vigor and attractiveness, do that. If you can increase mental health, decrease depression, social anxiety, and sexual dysfunctions, do that. So the most radical idea in my talk is for some disorders, STO exposure might actually be useful therapy. In 50 years, we might go, oh, what you need is this particular strain of herpes to cure your depression. And I'm kind of kidding, but I'm kind of not kidding also. If you do poo transplants to make the gut microbiome better, this might make sense. If you think the absolute lack of gut worms might be bad for the immune system because they don't have anything to practice on, it might also make sense that modern environments might have sort of maladaptively low levels of STOs relative to what our immune systems expect or relative to what our sexual behavior kind of evolved to expect. So STO strategy summary. If you could, you would like your host to do more consensual short-term mating, more exploitative short-term mating, disrupt long-term mating, impose sterility and kill babies, minimize your symptoms and contagion cues, increase the host sexual attractiveness, and eventually evolve from parasitism to mutualism. Now, of course, we have anti-STO defenses. We co-evolve against STOs that are imposing fitness costs on us. So to do that, we refine our disgust adaptations, so we're more sensitive to contagion, and we don't do things like just kiss newfound Irish lads willy-nilly on the Titanic. But another thing you might want to do is train your immune system to deal with STOs through early adult exposure to the more benign STOs. So maybe that's why Kate is kissing Leonardo there, right? Maybe you need some exposure to STOs so you can fight off the really bad ones later. Another thing you might do is get your mutualistic STOs to compete against the more virulent and fitness reducing STOs. There's also cultural adaptations against STO transmission. I think socially imposed monogamy, as we've seen since the rise of agriculture in the Holocene, is, it's partly about inheritance of land, and it's partly about social stability, it's partly about group competitive ability in warfare, but it might also be about managing STO transmission risk. And conservative kind of ideological defenses against so-called sexual degeneracy or against sexual positivity in general might be part of this anti-STO cultural defense. So when you hear people going, I stand for traditional marriage, sign the petition, gay marriage bad, bisexuality bad, polyamory bad, BDSM bad, everything, kissing bad, bear in mind there might be a latent psychology of sort of wariness of STOs and crucially wariness of STO manipulation of host behavior that might be being expressed through these apparently idiotic political attitudes. So in conclusion, we need a lot more better theory and data on STO manipulation, and if we got that in the evolutionary medicine community, I think it could lead to new insights into human sexual evolution. New explanations for the individual differences in sexual strategies that aren't heritable. We know all the sexual strategy stuff is about 50% heritable, plus or minus. The other 50% is not shared family environment. We know that has pretty much zero effect. But it might be differential exposure to particular STOs, particularly the benign ones that fly under the radar. We might have new ways to identify and diagnose STOs, right? Like you didn't have any borderline personality symptoms until age 24, and then suddenly you did. What happened? Is it childhood trauma suddenly reared its head, or did you have a new STO infection? Might be worth looking into. This might create new interventions for reducing harmful STO transmission in terms of public health. It might also, and this is the most speculative, but I think it's worth looking into, develop new therapies using the more mutualistic STOs to help with various physical conditions and mental conditions. And that would be analogous to probiotics for increasing gut microbiome health that has both physical and mental benefits. And with that, I'll take questions. Thank you.
So we missed just the first few minutes, so I hope we didn't miss much, but I work with parasites and other things and getting people sort of clean. The way you're describing it, there could possibly be some good things, but I don't know, it's a little iffy to me. I'm okay with gut flora, but this sounds like things are actually almost hijacking your system. Can you answer for what I'm interested in is how much is this theory and how much have they been actually able to figure out? We know for sure, like this is changing this hormone and this is changing this, and once it's eradicated, the person's sex drive. Do you have any of that kind of data?
That data isn't around yet. This is so at
all speculative, sort of?
At one level, this is all speculative theory, but at another level, there's thousands of papers on parasitic manipulation in non-human animals. So we know the theory of parasitic manipulation is very well established in other animals. We know that sexual manipulation by STOs is also pretty well studied in some other animals. But again, in humans, there's virtually no data. And we've looked pretty hard. There's virtually no data on STO manipulation in humans. So this is my sort of call for help in doing more research on this.
Okay. Thank you. Also, because you know how people who have Lyme's, it's basically a type of syphilis, and I deal with that a lot. I'm wondering, like when I deal with a lot of the autistic kids I know, all of them, 100% are mutant gut bacteria. I mean, never have I had a kid autistic who hadn't had a messed up gut. Are there certain characteristics or behavior, like have somebody gone, hey, let's go check male homosexuals, they all have this parasite. That hasn't been done yet?
There's been, for at least 25 years, a kind of idea that some male homosexuality might be influenced by STOs, but as far as I know, there's no evidence on that. It would certainly be worth looking into to do systematic studies of what exactly are the STO flora that different groups of humans have.
Yeah.
In interpreting those results, though, it's extremely important not to pathologize these pathogens, not to assume that the manipulations that are correlated with particular sexual behaviors are necessarily fitness reducing. And so some of this is sort of arguing that the old friends hypothesis for the gut microbiome might also extend to our old sexual friends.
Wow.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, good.
Old friends with benefits.
Old friends with, yes, old friends with benefits. Excellent. Yeah, at the microphone.
So this might be a little off topic, but previous questioner asked this in a roundabout way. What do you think about another spirochete organism, Lyme disease, as being sexually transmitted?
I know almost nothing about Lyme disease, so I can't speculate. But I suspect there's also a class of human pathogens, well, including toxo, that are sometimes sexually transmitted, but not typically sexually transmitted. And I think for that class of pathogens, it's also worth looking into these possible manipulation strategies.
So my question is, are you aware of that new research about how women take on the DNA of every sexual partner they've ever had? And is that part of your theory as well, or is there any connection there, or is that something
I
you
haven't thought about that. That's interesting. So there you'd have to run the analysis of what would your ex-lovers want you to do sexually, which is a perfectly valid question. And that would be interesting to look at. I don't think that the human DNA would have as easy a time evolving manipulation strategies as these STOs, because the only job these STOs have is sexual transmission, whereas human DNA has so many other competing
The other
demands.
part of that same research was that apparently, because it changes your DNA, that your future children also carry some of the DNA from previous partners.
Yeah, so that would make a great whole other talk.
Yeah.
No, seriously, that would be really cool to analyze. But we haven't thought in those terms. We've just been focused on these kind of microorganisms so far.
Okay.
So I was just curious, I mean, we know that syphilis, if you leave it long enough, you can get neurosyphilis. So obviously there's a brain connection there. Chlamydia, you can get PID, so that works with the infertility picture. But I mean, I'm trying to just think of the other ones. I know there's not solid data, but are there theories on mechanisms by which other STOs could be causing, like the actual mechanisms? I mean,
Yeah,
toxo
I
is a
mean,
great example. We know it.
The only mechanistic generalizations that seem to be valid in terms of parasitic manipulation in other species are these sort of neuromodulator and gene expression effects. And there's some nice review of that by Adamo, both her 2008 paper and also more recent papers by her, where she goes into these sorts of issues. What exactly are the kind of molecular mechanisms?
Cool, thank you.
Do we have time for one more? Okay.
Hi, Dr. Miller.
Hi.
Enjoyed your talk. I have a question. While listening to you speak, I was thinking about the disease model of addiction. So I think we're all aware that, like in modern society, alcoholism, drug abuse are often treated like diseases. And so I was wondering if you have any thoughts about like sex addiction, and would you consider that a disease, and how does that tie into your ideas in this talk? I know that experts kind of go both ways with the disease addiction model.
Yeah, so I think sex addiction is bullshit as a concept, and I would recommend David Lay's book, The Myth of Sex Addiction. However, these predictions about what STOs would like you to do lead to many of the same behaviors that the whole sex addiction industry worries about. And I think it's largely an extremely sex-negative, moralizing, shaming industry that is basically therapists who are monetizing sexual shame and guilt. However, there might be kind of a grain of truth, not that this kind of sexual behavior is an addiction the way alcoholism is, but that it's not necessarily in the interests of the human host. And that it's worth evaluating, whose interests exactly are driving it. Cool, I think I'm out of time. Thank you.
Art of barefoot running and walking.